Well, welcome to our fireside chat. For those of you who weren't here in the morning, I'll just reintroduce myself. I'm Mike Rosenblatt. I'm the co-chair of the Galien Forum today, and I have the great pleasure of engaging in a conversation with Noubar AFEYAN. Noubar, as I think most of you know, is the founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering, and he is also the co-founder and chairman of the board of Moderna. Noubar has really created an amazing company with a very unusual approach, which I think you'll find provocative and may even change the way that you think about how drugs are invented. I've had the honor of, first of all, I've known Noubar for, I think it's now like 3 decades, Noubar, and I've had the honor of being the first chief medical officer at Flagship Pioneering. And the reason I'm giving you that background is it's going to be quite natural for Noubar and I to have a conversation. In fact, Noubar, I think we should just speak and let these people eavesdrop on us. And so, you know, I think people will be really interested in hearing about what is distinctive about the Flagship Pioneering approach and the story of its origin and how it's developing. So please spend some time on that for us.
Great. Well, first, thanks for having me here. I've had the great pleasure of being in this venue, although not at this meeting before, and I appreciate the Alexandria folks and everything they do in this industry as well. So Flagship, which is going to enter its 25th year of existence next year, and when we started out in 2000, there was a thought we were trying to use as a motivating kind of factor, an experiment, if you will, which is could you imagine conceiving and creating companies as the act of a company and not as the act of some individuals who get together to start a company? Startups historically have been a fiercely personal activity. There's a lot of heroes who are startup founders. And having been involved for the prior more than a decade at that time in starting a company, growing it, and then being fortunate to be a co-founder of 4 other companies in the 90s, I had gotten this notion that maybe, just maybe, you could parallelize the process and taking a page from the book of investors, who of course being institutional investors are highly parallel in the way they think about company investment and growth. Could we do that as entrepreneurs? And we started out on that journey and to learn, quite humbly, to learn if you could do that, how could you do that? And what about the process of company invention, let me call it that, could be learned from and repeated. So we were focused on the intersection between biology and technology, which is where I've had worked already for many years before, and where we've continued to work. So we did not aspire to do this at the time in the internet, which was kind of being born at the same time. So the whole e-commerce craze, which caused a lot of people to be drawn to startups. We realized that science-based ventures are an altogether different thing. The timeframes are different, the risks are different, the kind of impact that you're trying to have is different. So for us, this was kind of a learning process. What has transpired over the years is that not only have we been getting, we think, better and better at being able to do this act in a repeatable, systematic, even I will dare to call it institutional way, but also over the years we realized that where we innovate and how we innovate might also need to be reconsidered. And so let me explain that part, which is probably even more, like you used the word, provocative. We observed over the first few years that the way innovation happens in any subspecialty, in any field, it really is an exploration of adjacencies. So at any given time, if you draw a circle around what's known and what exists, then everything outside that circle is most logically going to be what's next going to be known and what's next going to exist. And if you only knew in what order it's going to exist and in what order you can attribute value to it, you could print money, basically. And of course, investors are there trying to predict that very thing. And entrepreneurs are there to be the subject of that very prediction, exploring adjacencies for value. That over time, over the arrow of time, that circle asynchronously grows and expands. So if 5 years from now we drew another circle around the field, you could still do that, but it would include a bunch of new things. The zone of adjacency, I would argue, is the focus of most innovation. Now that could be innovation that is funded by government grant funding, by venture capital, by large company innovation. It kind of occupies this interesting adjacent zone. What we wondered is, okay, so what defines the edge of that zone? And we thought, well, how do you determine how risky something is? And the answer is you ask a lot of experts, and you try to gather lots of diverse views, and then you make a judgment. And so at the edge of the distance from what's known and exists today, that an expert's willing to opine on whether something will or won't work, that's a pretty safe description of the outer bound of the adjacency. And if you offer an idea beyond that, people will just basically say it's premature, it's irrational, it's unreasonable, stay away from it, don't waste your money. And so that kind of is, so we use due diligence and key opinion leaders as a judge of how safe it is to go away, knowing full well that reward and risk often correlate. And so if you don't take some risk, you probably are working on Me Too problems. So that zone of adjacency kind of defines what's next. And so the question is, could you work systematically outside that zone of adjacency? And that's kind of over the years what we've tried to figure out how to do. To do that, you'd need to be able to make leaps. And so scientific leaps, which are often described in hindsight, because when somebody makes a major discovery, it's described as a leap, actually often are the product of many sequential steps that are adjacency-oriented, and suddenly a new result comes up. We thought, could we just leap kind of by choice? Could we get into asking hypothetical questions, what-if questions, that really are built upon the current knowledge, the current adjacency orientation, but extend way beyond that. And that's what, as Flagship, as an entity, we've been learning and applying how to do. Now, you might say, well, if you leap to some distant place and you come up with something new that you could prove can work, then what? And well, the answer is you then have to come back to the present and chart a course to make that destination a reality. And that's kind of how we think about what we call pioneering, what we call kind of company creation, is it's the journey to a place that others would view unreasonably detached from the present, but actually you're trying to attach it to the present. And so if you said, how do you know that can work? The answer is you're certainly not certain it'll work, but if you just played with time, you'd know that there may have been ways to enable CAR-T 5-10 years earlier, if actually you believed that it was going to be possible. You may have been able to make vaccines from mRNA possible 10 years earlier, if you thought. So it's not as though we were like 10 inventions away. Turned out we were, in hindsight, 2 inventions away. But do you seek those inventions today, or do you let them happen over time? And that's the thing that we've been trying to figure out how to resource, how to develop mindsets around, and how to develop experience to do. So today, Flagship specializes in building a certain type of company. We call these platform companies. In the biotech industry, in the 38 years I've worked in it, there's always been this discussion about platforms and products. I think that distinction is a bit arbitrary. All platforms ultimately generate products. It's just that products don't generate platforms. Products are the terminal differentiated state of the value proposition, whereas platforms have a bit of a stem-like kind of state in that they could produce many, many different products. They are therefore viewed to be highly risky. They're certainly harder to execute, and from an investor standpoint, create some level of concern because people feel like you're not going to be focused enough. But the converse is, if you're going to go to a totally new value pool, we believe that a platform is the only way to prosecute a new value pool. So every bit as much as siRNA turned out to be a platform, mRNA is a platform, any number of cell therapies, viral therapies, etc., we think that platforms as a business model are the right way of daring to go beyond immediate adjacency. So those are some of the concepts of how Flagship's been thinking about what it does. Today, Flagship's about 500 people, about 200 are PhDs, MDs. We file about 500 patents a year out of the central labs. We are developing 6 to 8 new companies that are platforms a year. They span the gamut of all disease areas or many disease areas, any number of technological approaches. And it's a really scary undertaking because every year we start with essentially nothing, and we have to come up with several new value pools that nobody believes exist, including us, but we're willing to try to go see if actually there's any value there. And we are hoping that on average, some value gets generated to make all this worth it. And by value, I don't mean financial value, I mean impact as measured by products that get to patients.
I want to pick up on the word scary, because when I first arrived and tried to learn this way of thinking, people would ask me what was it like to learn a different way of thinking. And I said, well, a key ingredient was to unlearn the reflexes that you normally had for inventing a drug and making these leaps that are really white-knuckle rides. So I'm particularly interested in the kind of brain that comes up with ideas like this. And I've heard you speak before about the mindset of an immigrant and how that has certain advantages for thinking this way. I'm interested in it because, like you, I'm an immigrant, brought up in an immigrant household. But I think there's some general ways of thinking in this mindset that would be of interest to our audience.
Sure, and so you get to be on a fireside like this if you get old. And so basically Mike and I have talked about this topic for decades, and it turns out that the more we talk about it, the less we realize we know, and so we keep learning. It is a rich stream of thought to think, how does immigration actually look like innovation? And I've come to view innovation as just intellectual immigration. A physical immigrant actually leaves the comfort of where they belong, where they're accepted, where they're comfortable, where they know the language, the value system, and they go to a place where they know none of those things. They go there out of a sheer act of often irrational optimism that there's a better life awaiting them. Sometimes they're chased out, they have no choice. But that act of essentially exposing yourself to these unknowns and then adapting, fitting, and actually competing and sometimes kind of prevailing in these new places, turns out, I believe, to be very much what entrepreneurs and innovators do. They create new realities that they colonize, and the mindsets are quite similar. Now, that does not mean that you have to be an immigrant to be an innovator and entrepreneur, but does mean that you have to have an immigrant mindset, in my view. And in a country like this, which is entirely founded on immigration, I had the great honor of giving the commencement address at MIT this year, which was my alma mater, which was a daunting task being a student there 38 years ago, graduating from there. And I did an experiment, which is that I asked the audience of about 15,000 people, how many of them were immigrants or whose parents were immigrants or whose grandparents were immigrants. And well over 80% of the crowd stood up sequentially. And you just look around and you realize that the whole country and the next wave of people who are going to be populating this are just immigrants. That gives this country, in my view, a sustainable competitive advantage, if we sustain it, of being oriented towards these kinds of leaps. Because if you've made the leap physically, you're likely going to be more comfortable making it over and over again. Or you can infect people who haven't made the leap quite like you have to think this way. So that's a belief I have. And I'll just build on that by a couple of other points. Something like 2000, same time we started Flagship, at the then president of MIT, Chuck Vest, asked me to kind of try to teach entrepreneurship. And of course, I had never taken a course in entrepreneurship, and most entrepreneurs, all entrepreneurs, believe you cannot learn this, and you can just kind of be it. Since you're in the crowd, I'll infect you with my one life thought, which is that the word entrepreneurship, in my view, is an awful expression. Not because of the French side of the word, which usually means an expensive word compared to the English side. It's those of you who know the difference between a vase and a vase. It's about $5,000. So that's, so entrepreneur is this, if it was called enterpriser or otherwise opportunist, it would be a cheap word, but entrepreneur sounds like a very, but the part of the word that I always quip with is the ending, which is ship. Leadership, friendship, sportsmanship, craftsmanship, all of these ships mean the state of being something, which is why we generally as a society think these people are born. They are in a state of being an entrepreneur. But actually, I think that, like as an engineer, I don't do engineership. I do engineering. So I continue to look forward to the day where the word entirely changes to entrepreneuring. I think that a lot more people who think they can't do entrepreneurship can do entrepreneuring because it's a learned activity. And so when I started to teach it, one of the things they asked about is mindsets. And I had to force myself to say, okay, if I can only have two mindsets, because really I have to have one, it's hard to have one, what would they be? And for me, it would be the blend of paranoia and optimism. Like, to me, somebody who's willing to go to the outer edges and find value pools where people don't think there are any, need to be paranoid optimists. Optimists, to suspend disbelief and go there, paranoid not to believe their own assumptions, and constantly iterate, learn, adapt, and in this survivalistic mode. So paranoid optimist is the mindset. And again, I think that most immigrants, refugees who actually fight back and try to adapt and do something in the place they end up are paranoid optimists. That mindset is important. The last thing I'll say is I used the word leap before. And again, just for shock value, that's why Mike invited me. I'll invite you to also think about the following thought. We think about science as in a particular way, and we think about religion in a completely different way. But interestingly, I believe they share one common mindset, and that is this notion of faith. Faith, religiously, means the same thing as faith as it applies to science, although I'm sure you've never heard it applied to science, which is belief without facts. I believe all hypotheses are a form of faith. You have to have a belief, an assertion, without fact. And then in science, we go about trying to do the experiments that actually tries to falsify that hypothesis, after which we generate facts, new facts, that either no longer require faith, because now that belief is substantiated by facts, which is called science, or you fail, in which case you come up with another belief without facts, and then you test it. So the reason I say that is that I think that as you go further and further from slight iterations of what's already known, you are in the business of making leaps of faith. And it's not a bad thing to be able to make a leap of faith, provided you don't go tell people that this works when you have no evidence for it. So in science, we're armed with fact-gathering techniques to basically not rely on faith for too long. And that interesting parallel, at least to me during COVID, came out because a lot of the religions, etc., in the world, I was invited to participate in this very interesting session in the Vatican where they brought a lot of different denominations, churches together to say what's going on to humanity in the middle of this frontal attack on our health. And what I pointed out to them is that there is an initial commonality, except for by going into labs and testing whether a vaccine can actually be safe and whether it can be effective or whether a diagnostic test can rapidly detect who does and doesn't have a disease. We try to use faith temporarily in order to generate science. Now, those of you in the room who are bona fide scientists might find what I'm saying a little crazy, but if you just think abstracted a little bit, how do we teach students, how do we teach our next generation to ability to use their imagination, to be willing to take these leaps, to imagine things that don't seem obvious, and still be able to work on them and make people, give them the resources? That's the thing we've been exploring and grappling with.
Noubar, I want to return to Flagship for a moment. So I don't know what the number now is, 110, 120 companies created by Flagship pioneering, and the vast majority of these are platform companies. So, but you're in a large sector and you're unique. What's your place in the ecosystem, and how do you interface with that ecosystem?
Well, we depend on science that's being developed in academia, first and foremost, which is both basic science and applied science, which provides us the definition of what is known today, the first inkling of what's going to be known tomorrow based on the experiments being done, from which we take our point of departure. We also rely on that for the source of the kind of scientists that we bring in-house, and as you said, sometimes unlearn, learn new things, but essentially they are the inhabitants of our platform, the Flagship platform. But then more broadly, ultimately our platforms are generating products. And so one of the interesting problems we often have is when they're at the stage of platforms, they are so not believable that it's hard to interact with the large pharma companies or other places. So we go through a lot of kind of collaboration phases to make what we do compatible with what people are looking for. And you heard in the last panel in immunology, inflammation. So we have probably 25 different assets that are being developed within our new platforms. At the end of the day, they're going after unmet needs that have other approaches to go after. So we can't just kind of detach ourselves so it's unrelatable. But what we have found is that our entire ecosystem can benefit greatly from strategic partnerships. Over the last couple of years, we have forged partnerships with Novo, with Pfizer, and most recently with GSK, and we're hoping to forge many other partnerships. These are partnerships that cut across all of our platforms and envision up to 10 assets being developed jointly over the next 3-4 years that derive especially from these unprecedented platforms, where we have found that our partners are willing to take a leap of faith that these platforms can generate products of interest to them even before the products exist. And one of the things we realize is that no matter how many experts you gather in your startup company, it will pale in comparison to the disease expertise, the development expertise, even the research expertise that these large pharma companies have, where what we're good at is to go to places that might be kind of at the toxic extreme of where they are willing to or able to go because there's no proof. But as soon as we show proofs of concept, they don't want to wait till everybody's doing it. Right. They want to be able to apply it very early on. So we're finding ways to become, ideally, Mike, just this notion we've been throwing around over the last few years is, how can we create innovation supply chains in this industry? How can we, instead of every innovation transacting, so you do a phase 2B and then you sell an asset and hope you get a lot of money, it's a bit of a lottery mentality we follow, versus how can we create these linkages, the way manufacturing industries have had for decades and more almost a century, in the innovation side. And that's something that I think over the next few years are going to come. By the way, the tech industry has these innovation supply chains in a big way. So in other words, the innovations that go into an iPhone platform, not the components, the innovations that allow the Apple to say, 5 years from now, we're going to have this and these capabilities, are completely done by other people. But that coordination and organization of where Apple needs to go, wants to go, and where its suppliers of innovation are going is a real challenging but interesting activity. So it very much is like an ecosystem where you create symbiosis, mutualism between breakthrough innovation makers and the ultimate downstream players. And that's what we're working on.
Terrific. Noubar, we have time for only one more question. And it's one that I think is important. I want people in this audience to know about it. I've admired your philanthropy and your engagement and your generosity. And just like the other arenas where you're active, in many ways you've had an unusual approach, a novel approach to it. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share with this group the generosity you and Anna have had in philanthropy.
Well, this kind comments, Mike. This is a city full of extreme philanthropists. So, especially in New York, this is kind of part of the water, in my view. So we have a lot to learn. And this is a country, by the way. Most people don't realize, since I get to travel all around the world, the percentage of private philanthropy that this country represents in the globe. I can't give you the exact number, but it's certainly well north of 95%. If you take government philanthropy out, the by far personal philanthropy. I'm not talking about, obviously there's very large foundations now, like the Nova Foundation, Wellcome Foundation, but I'm talking about individuals, individual entities basically applying. So I almost feel like if you move to this country and you get the benefit of its fruits, you kind of have to kind of bring that into consideration. In our case, my background is by my kind of ethnic origin from a long time ago is that I'm Armenian. And Armenia is a small country. It's gone through a lot. It used to be a Soviet country until 30 years ago. So among the areas we got involved with was to try to apply what we were doing here to the development of a country. And I knew as much about starting companies or biotechnology or AI or anything when I got into those areas as I did about country development, which was exactly nothing. But, it turns out that in emerging countries and in countries that face a lot of challenges, one of the things you realize is they don't know how to do it either. So it's kind of a white sheet of paper. You just have to kind of try and learn. And so over the years, that led us to a number of different projects. But probably the most visible and impactful project that I'd love people to at least follow at some point is a project we started a decade ago called Aurora Humanitarian Initiative. And that is not an Armenian project, that's a global project. And so what we realized was that, this is like 10 years ago, there were a lot less conflicts in the world, but in a funny way. It was pre-pandemic, it was pre-kind of active wars, but there were 65 million refugees that had already been displaced in Europe and other places. So we got engaged with this notion of, how do you bring the attention of the world to a special class of people? And I'm going to use the word here, so again, I don't want to touch on religion, but just let me use it technically. These are people who are saviors. They save other people's lives. So it turns out that in every conflict, there are perpetrators, often of pretty bad things, and there are victims. But there are also survivors, and we hear about those, and there are also saviors, because often just random people step in and help. Now, if that's an accident on the highway here, they're called Good Samaritans. But if somebody actually risks their lives to save thousands and tens of thousands of people, that's something quite extraordinary. And so we decided to start Aurora as an initiative and a movement to try to bring the world's attention on these people as inspiration for kind of retail, I'll call, humanitarianism. It turns out, if I say humanitarian, you might think crisis, relief, organization, government. You would never be able to tell me a name, right? If I say biologist, if I say physicist, you give me names of humans. So interestingly and ironically, human is not really that important in the word humanitarian anymore, because the world doesn't view it as an individual act. The world views it as an organizational act. And that's what our project is trying to do, is to really try to instill back the human, not only in the recipient of the humanitarian act, but in the giver of the humanitarian act. And that's what Aurora is trying to do, and that's given us incredible access to these people. Every year we do there's a prize. It's a $1 million prize. The unusual part about the prize is that the recipient, often who has basically no resources whatsoever, they're dependent on other organizations' support, they get to keep 100,000 of it, and they give away the 900,000 to people whose work they value. And so imagine that turning of the circle, where they go from being recipient to giver of humanitarian support, and we figured they have the best deal flow. They know whose work is the most valuable, as opposed to central organizations who are vetting and testing. So in those ways, we've experimented. By the way, a lot of things we tried aren't the right ideas, so we keep iterating. But through Aurora and through some of the other things, I would urge people, there's no, you learn when you have resources that you can be charitable. Sometimes you're motivated by guilt. Sometimes you're motivated by kindness. I find guilt and kindness have pretty short half-lives. At least, and I'd like to think I'm a kind person, but I'm not that kind. And I get distracted by other things. But it turns out that this notion that we tried to focus on, which is gratitude. All of us have been given opportunities through acts of others, which has instilled in us a sense of gratitude. And gratitude has this interesting property in that if you can infect somebody else with gratitude, if you do something that changes their lives, and it doesn't exhaust your gratitude. So then the next day you still feel gratitude because you feel like you unfairly got ahead and you should do something about it. So I really mean this. It may sound kind of soft and romantic, but I would urge you, especially in this industry, by the way, since we work on drugs and we work on vaccines and we work on doing good to humanity, we are expressing a gratitude and we're doing good for mankind every single day. But you can go beyond that. And you can go beyond that to say, how do I express my gratitude to people in whom I can instill that same debt so that they then start feeling like, well, what do I do with this gratitude now I have? And I got to do something next. So it's this notion of paying forward. We call it gratitude in action. And that's what we've kind of zeroed in on in our philanthropy. It's gratitude in action.
Noubar, this has just been a great conversation. We could go on, but I'm very grateful to you for doing it, and I would like the audience to thank Noubar for this wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.